So how are wars really won? Is it about one heroic moment on a battlefield, a single brilliant general, or is it something deeper, something that was decided years before the first shot was even fired? What if I told you that the P battle for the Pacific in World War II wasn't really fought on the waves at all, but in shipyards, thousands of miles from the action? Okay, let's really get into this, because what we're about to uncover isn't just a history lesson. It's a blueprint for overwhelming an enemy so completely that their strategy, their courage, their entire war effort just becomes irrelevant. Just look at these two numbers for a second, 480 to 30. Now, that's not the score of a baseball game. That is the actual aircraft loss count from a single day of combat in the Pacific. It breaks down to a kill ratio of 16 to 1. Let that sink in. For every one American plane that was lost, the Japanese lost 16. It's a level of dominance that sounds less like a battle and more like, well, a complete wipeout. How on earth does something like this even happen between two major world powers? The day was June 19th, 1944. The official name was the Battle of the Philippine Sea. But the American pilots who were actually there, well, they gave it a different name. A nickname that tells you everything you need to know about the one-sided reality of what they saw that day. They called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name itself says it all, doesn't it? It wasn't a fight, it was a slaughter. And that really brings us to the core question here, the one we have to answer. How is a victory this absolute, this utterly crushing, even possible? I mean, it seems to defy the normal logic of war. This wasn't just a good day for one side. This was the result of a system that was specifically designed to make victory inevitable. And if you can understand that system, you'll understand exactly how America won the Pacific War. So let's start in the most obvious place you can. Let's look at the tools of the trade. We're talking about the fighter planes up in the sky, and of course, the pilots sitting inside them. This is that classic story of man and machine. And believe me, the differences here, they are stark. What's so fascinating here is the clash of philosophies. On the American side, you've got the F-6F Hellcat. This thing was a beast. You could call it a flying tank. It had 6 heavy machine guns, it was built tough, and it was designed to take a beating and then dish out way more. Then you have the Japanese Zero. Now, the Zero was a legend from the early days of the war, famous for its incredible agility. But by 1944, that agility was a death trap. It couldn't save it from the Hellcat's sheer speed, heavy armor, and overwhelming firepower. You know, there was a U.S. Navy ace, Lieutenant Alexander Vachu, who, during the Turkey Shoot, shot down 6 Japanese planes in just 8 minutes. He talked about their tactic. It was simple and brutal. Climb high above the Zeros, dive down with all 6 guns blazing, and then use your superior speed and power to climb back up and do it all over again. The Zero pilots, they literally never had a chance. But, you know, a better plane is only half of the equation. You need a pilot who knows how to use it. And this right here, this is where the gap becomes a chasm. That American pilot in his Hellcat, he probably had over 500, maybe even 1,000 hours of flight time. He was the product of this intense 6-month training pipeline that was just churning out thousands of qualified pilots. And the Japanese pilot he was up against, he was probably a rookie with less than 100 hours in the air. You see, Japan's veteran pilots, the heroes of Pearl Harbor and Midway, they were almost all gone, and their 18-month-long training program just couldn't replace them fast enough. So America wasn't just building better planes, it was building better pilots, and it was doing it at a terrifying speed. Okay, so a better plane and a better pilot. That explains a lot, right? But it doesn't explain 480 to 30. It doesn't explain that kind of total dominance. And that's because so far, we've only been looking at the very tip of the spear. To get the whole story, we have to look at the platforms these planes were launching from. We have to talk about the aircraft carriers themselves. And this brings us to an idea that is so often overlooked when people talk about this war. It's not just about the ships as physical objects, but the idea behind them. The American carriers were built around a core philosophy of survivability. This idea that a ship's single greatest weapon is its ability to take a massive punch and just keep on fighting. You could call it an unsinkable idea. So, the American Essex-class carrier, it was designed from the very beginning to survive. Every single crew member, from the captain to the cooks, was cross-trained in damage control. They had these brilliant sealed fuel systems with CO2 purging to stop the kinds of fuel vapor explosions that had destroyed the Japanese fleet at Midway. And critically,
They were standardized. A sailor could move from one Essex to another and know exactly where everything was. Japanese carriers, on the other hand, were built for pure offense, often sacrificing defense to do it. They were gorgeous, powerful ships, but they were incredibly fragile. A single bomb in the wrong place could, and often did, lead to a total catastrophic loss.
If you want the perfect, most brutal example of this philosophy in action, just look at the USS Franklin. On March 19, 1945, she was hit by 2 armor-piercing bombs. What happened next was basically hell on the water. Her hangar deck was packed with fully fueled and armed aircraft, and it just erupted. A chain reaction of explosions, massive fires. The ship suffered over 1,000 casualties. That is the highest number for any U.S. carrier that actually survived the war. By all logic, the Franklin should have been at the bottom of the Pacific. And yet, despite damage that would have vaporized any Japanese carrier, despite these unimaginable losses, the U.S. Franklin did not sink. Her crew, those who were left, they fought the fires, they sealed the holes, they got the engines running again, and that ship sailed 12,000 miles all the way back to New York City, completely under her own power. Now that wasn't luck. That was by design. That was the American philosophy of survivability made real.
So let's recap. We have better planes, we have better trained pilots, and we have tougher, more resilient ships. But you know what? Even all of that, all of it, combined, still doesn't explain the true scale of the American advantage. To really understand that, we have to pull the camera way back. We have to look away from the ocean completely and focus on the real battlefield, the factories and shipyards back home in the United States.
I want you to really think about this question for a second. What if the most decisive weapon in the war wasn't the Hellcat fighter or the Essex-class carrier? What if it was the Newport News shipyard in Virginia? What if it was a Bethlehem steel plant? What if victory wasn't forged in the heat of battle, but in the heat of a blast furnace on an assembly line that simply could not be stopped? Take a look at this. This chart shows the number of new fleet carriers that each side commissioned in one single year, 1943. It's staggering. The U.S. produced more fleet carriers in that one year than Japan had managed to build in the entire 2 decades before the war. After Pearl Harbor, Japan completed exactly one new fleet carrier, the Taiho. It lasted 3 months before it was sunk. America, meanwhile, was launching a brand new Essex-class carrier, on average, every 2 months.
This wasn't just shipbuilding anymore. This was a flood. The Yorktown, the Intrepid, the Hornet, the Franklin. It just went on and on and on, a relentless tide of steel. While Japan was struggling for years to build a single, custom-designed carrier, American shipyards were using modular construction and standardized designs to slide them into the water one after the other, like clockwork. The Japanese couldn't sink them faster than America could build them. In fact, they couldn't really sink them at all. Not a single Essex-class carrier was ever lost to enemy action in the entire war.
This table, right here, it just lays out the raw, undeniable math of the outcome. 24 Essex-class carriers, an average build time of about 20 months, compared to 4 or 5 years for Japan. Grumman Aircraft pumped out over 12,000 Hellcats. It was an industrial tsunami. For Japan, the war was no longer about strategy or tactics. It became a simple, brutal equation of attrition that they had absolutely no hope of winning. They were being buried alive by numbers. And this quote from Vice Admiral John McCain, who actually commanded these massive carrier task forces, it just perfectly captures the entire American mindset. It was never about seeking a fair fight. It was about creating a system of such overwhelming material and personnel superiority that the fight was essentially over before it even began. It was about fighting to win, decisively, completely. So, after all that, what's the big takeaway? What's the lasting lesson from this story of the Essex carriers? Well, it's about understanding a concept that goes way beyond just building a lot of ships. It's about understanding the legacy of overwhelm. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, the guy in overall command of the Pacific, he said it best. He didn't just see a fleet of ships, he saw a systematic superiority. Those are his words, and they are the absolute key to this whole story. It wasn't one thing. It was everything, all working together. The factories, the training programs, the logistics, the ship design, the technology. It was the whole entire system. So let's just define this, because this is the real payoff. Systematic superiority. It's when your nation's entire system, your industry, your logistics, your training, creates an advantage so enormous, so overwhelming, that whatever the enemy tries to do on the battlefield, it almost doesn't matter. Their brilliant plans, their courageous soldiers, they all just get crushed under the sheer weight of your ability to produce, to deploy, and to replace. You literally make their strategy irrelevant. So what does this history give us? It gives us a blueprint, a clear 4-part blueprint for overwhelm. First, create standardized, high-quality, and really tough designs. Second, build them faster than your enemy can possibly get rid of them. Third, produce a non-stop river of well-trained people to operate all that equipment. And fourth, maybe the most important part, support all of it with a logistics network that can keep the whole machine running for months at a time, thousands of miles away from home. That is the blueprint.
And that's where this whole story comes back to you. Because this isn't just about history. This blueprint for creating systematic superiority, it didn't just disappear in 1945. It's a timeless strategy. So where do you see it being used to win today? Think about the business world. A massive company whose supply chain and production scale make it almost impossible for small competitors to even exist. Think about the world of tech, where one company's ecosystem of hardware and software creates an advantage that no single rival can possibly match. This blueprint decided the outcome of a world war, but its principles are still shaping our world every single day. The real question is, now that you know what to look for, where are you going to see it next?